afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. Very happy to have you all here with us today. Appreciate it. It's September. Seniors, you should be in it, in the thick of it right now. And if you are not, you need to get in the thick of it, because if you don't, your parents and your school counselor might be unhappy with you. So we are as busy as we get in the college admissions process right now. And in today's show, we're going to talk about how parents can be involved appropriately in the application process. And we're also going to try to cut through all of the different acronyms, ED, EA, REA, SCEA. There's a lot of things going on, and we're going to talk you through all of them. But before we get to any of that, I'm going to get to what I often find is probably the question that more families have than not, and that is around applying for financial aid and welcoming. I'd love to welcome my colleague, Beth Feinberg Keenan, who is also a former financial aid officer at Northeastern. Hi, Beth.
Hi, Beth. Thanks so much for having me today.
Absolutely. Like I said, this is a big question for most families. And today we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how you apply for aid, and then also when and even whether you should, which is a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to get into it right away. And my first question for you is, what forms do families need to think about if they're going to apply for aid?
So for families who are in the thick of it, hopefully this isn't a surprise, what they need to apply, what forms they have to fill out for financial aid. The FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, is still the primary application that families are going to be using to apply for financial aid. The CSS profile is another form that about 200-ish colleges require to apply for financial aid. So families, if you don't know what forms are required by the schools that your students are looking at, then make sure that you're checking out their financial aid websites, or kind of giving your students a to-do list, and check out which forms are required for financial aid, not only for admission. And then depending on the schools that your students are applying to, some of them might require your taxes, they might require your W-2s, they might have their own institutional application, or maybe a scholarship application. So it's so important to make sure that you know every single form, because I have to admit, like, I've had conversations with families and they're like, we thought we were going to get this scholarship. My student was a sure win. And then we're looking through everything and it's like, hey, I missed a form, or I missed a deadline.
Yeah. Yep, can't do that. And actually, later on in the show, Lisa Albro and I are going to talk about ways in which parents can be appropriately involved. And actually, this is one of them, right? So if your student has the time, they can look the deadlines up or look up the forms that are required. But if you as a parent are sort of like, I need something to do, this is a great thing that you can be involved in. And actually leads right to my next question. So we're talking about deadlines and not missing them. So the big question that a lot of people have is, when should I apply for financial aid?
So in terms of applying for financial aid, you don't want to wait till your student's admitted to apply for financial aid and start that process. But every single school has their own deadline. The CSS profile is going to become available October 1st. So if your students, if the schools require that, you want to start, filling that form out as early as October 1st. The FAFSA, we always tell families, and I think, Beth, you can agree with me, we always tell families, fill it out October 1st. But this year is an anomaly. And there's some big changes in FAFSA simplification, and the FAFSA is being redone. So that form isn't going to be available until December. But we don't know if it's early December, mid-December, or late December. So kind of just keep, stay engaged with us. Keep listening to our podcast, interacting with our blog posts. And as soon as we find out, we're going to make sure that families are on top of things, or even follow us on social media, because we're going to put a Facebook post out there. We're going to put it on Twitter. We're going to put it everywhere. Right. When is the FAFSA available? And then also scholarships. Like, I was working with a family earlier today, and it was just a state school in Delaware, and it said that, you have to apply by January 15th in order to be automatically considered for merit scholarships. And you'll find that with many schools that your student doesn't have to apply, early. So early action, early decision that you'll talk about later, but maybe they have to meet like a December 1st deadline. They have to meet a January 15th deadline, whatever it is. That is so simple to miss. And parents, if that's something you want to make sure your student doesn't miss to leave free money on the table, make sure you know what those deadlines are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, oftentimes families assume that you're going to apply for financial aid at the same time that you apply for admission, but it's different forms, and it can be different deadlines, right?
Correct. It's often different deadlines, but typically they coincide that you're not going to wait till the student's been admitted till you start the whole entire financial aid application process. So if your students are applying early, typically your deadlines are early November, maybe mid-November. If your students are applying regular decision, you might have deadlines that are a little bit later and maybe into the next year, but it's not going to be months and months after. So
Right.
you might have a little bit of, wiggle room, but I always try to encourage families to do it simultaneously. So if the student's kind of doing the admissions application side, parents, maybe you can jump on the bandwagon and start doing the financial aid pieces and getting that taken care of and checked off.
Right, exactly. And I do want to highlight two things that you mentioned that are really important. One being remain engaged with us, because as this process, which is changing this year, as we get more details and the specifics, we're going to be talking about that both on the podcast. We'll write about it in our blog. We'll tweet about it. We'll post on social media. We also have already covered what we think is happening in these different areas. So if you haven't gone to our blog, you can go in there. You can search information about the new FAFSA, and you can find more what we've already covered. You'll be able to find there. I also think it's important to note that, like you said, normally we would be like, hey, apply for financial aid, fill out the FAFSA on October 1. I think we believe that next year, so for those of you who are listening and thinking, I don't need to worry about that this year because my student is only a junior or sophomore or freshman, it should return, I believe, right, to October 1st next year.
I think you're right, Beth. We haven't heard anything different just because the form is just being revamped that, they plan to use the new form going forward, bearing that there's, any other changes that are major changes that will be made.
Right, right, right. Caveat is always, we say what we believe is happening in this very moment, but things could change. You've mentioned a couple of times now, not waiting to hear if the student is admitted before applying for financial aid. Why is that? I know there are some families who think, well, we'll just wait and we'll apply. And that way, if they're in, then we can find out more about the financial situation. What's the downside to waiting?
So the downside to waiting is if you are a family who's going to qualify for need-based financial assistance, you could miss a deadline. So I
Mhm.
think we talked about deadlines, a few minutes ago. So that's one downside, is that you could miss a deadline. The second thing is that schools will go out with financial aid packages at the same time that students are being admitted or shortly after they've been admitted. So if you haven't completed the financial aid applications, you're not going to necessarily know what type of financial aid has been offered to your student at the time that they've been admitted. And the closer it gets to May 1st, when you have to deposit to that institution, if you're still haven't filled out the form, and you're still waiting, you may need to make a deposit to a school without knowing if that school, in fact, is affordable, if money and financial aid is factoring into that decision if your student can attend that college.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is that there are families who think, well, I don't want them to. They are afraid that applying for aid is going to impact their ability to get accepted. And we could talk about that in a second. And I guess my primary message here, and I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, Beth, is what good does it do you to get accepted if
Yeah.
you can't afford it, right? But what are your thoughts around the impact of applying for financial aid on your chances of being admitted? It's a
So
tricky one.
it is a tricky one. And I think that, Beth, you definitely bring up a great point, because there are definitely some schools who may factor in your ability to pay when they're making a decision. But on the same side, if you can't afford to send your child to that school, what's the difference if your child gets in or not, unless you're willing to take on an exorbitant amount of debt? And
Right,
then you have to kind of like, that's a whole other conversation, for
right.
another
And
time.
we'll talk about that in another podcast
Right.
episode.
Like
Yes.
that's a conversation for another time. But if your child is a very strong student and they can get in under their own academic attributes, then there really shouldn't be a concern if you're applying for aid or not, and how that might impact, because the school might not even look at the financial aid applications and the family's ability to pay when making that decision.
Right.
But I think the families, there are definitely schools that are need blind. If the schools need blind and 100% need blind, whether you apply for aid or not, it doesn't matter. The school's not
Right.
going to factor in your ability to pay. So your very selective schools or your Ivies that aren't necessarily going to factor in your ability to pay, it's a
Right.
non-issue.
Yep.
And then there are schools, there's definitely a large percentage of schools that are need aware. So, if they are need aware and you are concerned and you don't think I was going to say you're going to have any eligibility for financial aid, then you know what? Wait. Go ahead and wait to apply because you want to make sure that the decision that you're making in terms of when you're applying for financial aid, that you want to have a clear conscience that it didn't have any impact or influence on your students' ability to get in. But
Right.
most schools that we've talked to and colleagues on the admission side that we've talked to, most schools are pretty neutral. If a student applies for financial aid and it's a strong student, it's not necessarily going to impact their ability to get in. It might impact when they're really coming down to maybe that last 100 spots, last couple hundred spots, and they know they don't really have any money left. I saw that when I was a work study student in college, and they knew that they couldn't fund these students, and they were like, "Okay, we admit these students, we deny these students, and we put these students on the wait list."
Right.
But it's a great conversation. It's something really you have to think about.
Well, and those students, I think it's a good point. First of all, it was a small percentage, right? That's certainly
Yeah.
something that I hear from all my colleagues who worked at need-aware institutions, a very small percentage of the applicant pool. And it's those students who are on the bubble. And again, if you are on the bubble and you can't afford to go, if you don't get financial aid, I almost figure why not get turned down and
Right.
not get the aid, and then you don't get yourself into a huge debt hole. I would really hope that if you walk away from this podcast episode, that the message you received is, if you need the financial aid, you really should apply for it. You really don't know what your student's going to look like in that applicant pool. They could be, in that given year, a really strong applicant. In another year, they might be a fringe applicant. But if they were a fringe applicant, it's generally applying for aid is not the thing that's going to mean they don't get in. They're probably going to wind up on the wait list or even denied anyway, because the school just doesn't have enough spots. So yeah, it's a tricky thing for sure. I'm looking back, and I guess last question is probably around, because I think we talked about, like, should you apply, should you not apply? What if you're pretty sure you're not going to qualify for financial aid? Is it worth applying even if you think we're not going to get anything?
So it's not a straight yes or no answer. That's where you have to look at pros and cons. The pros are in terms of applying are, look at, does the school require you to apply for financial aid to be considered for merit scholarships? And
Yes.
if you don't apply for that first year, is that going to impact subsequent years? I think NYU is a good example that they have it on their website. You have to apply for financial aid that first year to be automatically considered. Some schools will give out scholarships, maybe $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 for just applying.
Yeah.
So making sure that, again, you're not leaving free money on the table. If you think you're going to have a change in circumstances, another pro of why you think you need to apply for, go through the process, or if parent loans or student loans are a way that you're going to pay for college, again, another reason that a pro of why you want to go through the process. But on the flip side, if it's really stressful to you and you know what, you're not going to qualify for financial aid and you're not going to have any change in circumstances, and the school doesn't require this for merit aid, you know what? Don't.
Yeah.
Don't put yourself through that. Don't put yourself through that stress. And it's one thing that you don't have to do. And you can kind of just say, cross that off the list. And maybe in upper class years, you decide that you're going to have your student take out an educational loan or you need to take out a parent loan. And then you do it at that time. But I don't think it's a cut and dry answer about to say, like, you know what? If you're not going to qualify for aid, you shouldn't do it or you should do it. I think families have to weigh the pros and the cons to decide if this is the right thing for them to do or to cross off the list and say, we don't need to do it.
Right. And I think the other really key point you made is that they need to look at the rules at every school that their child is applying to, because if you're thinking, oh, I'll apply later on and then my student can take out some loans, but you are at NYU, who has clearly said either apply for it when you're entering as a freshman, or that's it. That's your only option. You don't want to be out in the cold. So All excellent points. Beth, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Beth, for having me. I really love being here with you.
Absolutely. We love having you. We're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to talk more about how ways in which parents can be properly involved in the application process. So don't go away.